Saint Denis is where the Linde gang loses its balance. The bank robbery fails. Lenny dies on a rooftop with no time for anyone to grieve, and the deeper break happens on the street outside the bank, when Hosea Matthews is dragged forward by the Pinkertons and shot in front of the people who needed him most. In the world we know, that single moment removes the oldest counterweight Dutch still has. It takes away the man who could smile at Dutch's speeches and still hear the panic underneath them. It takes away the partner who remembered Dutch before the legend, before Tahiti, before the need to turn every disaster into proof of destiny. So, if Hosea survives Saint Denis, the question is not simply whether the gang survives too. The better question is what happens when the voice of caution remains alive long enough to witness the dream turning into a fever. So let the city settle around that thought for a moment. Saint Denis at night is smoke, gaslight, wet stone, carriage wheels, iron railings, church bells, river air, and money moving behind polished windows. It is the modern world made physical, the very world Dutch claims to hate and cannot stop wanting to rob. The gang enters the city believing it can strike one last grand blow and disappear with enough money to become free. Hosea knows better than most of them that no robbery is ever only the robbery. There is the route in, the route out, the witnesses, the law, the timing, the temper of the men involved, and the invisible question of whether the whole thing is already bait. Hosea is not fearless. He is experienced. Experience, in Red Dead Redemption 2, often looks like a man standing very still, while everyone else calls stillness cowardice. In the original story, Hosea's death gives Dutch a wound he can turn into permission. After Saint Denis, Dutch becomes more exposed, more erratic, more willing to treat doubt as betrayal. Without Hosea beside him, Arthur's concerns become easier to dismiss as weakness, illness, or disloyalty. Micah gains space because the old man who could read him is gone. The gang loses a strategist and a social rhythm. Hosea could joke, con, scold, bargain, and soften a room. He could make Dutch listen without making Dutch feel small, which was one of the rarest skills in the gang. When Hosea falls, that skill falls with him. But imagine the street again with one small change. Milton still wants a public execution. The Pinkertons still want the gang broken in front of itself. Hosea is still dragged into view, tired and thin, his hat gone or crooked, his old face carrying the calm of a man who knows fear should not be given too much theatre. Milton fires. The gang hears the shot. Dutch breaks. Arthur reaches for violence. But Hosea does not die cleanly on the street. The bullet tears through him badly, perhaps catching ribs, lung, shoulder, the edge of the body instead of the center. He drops as if dead because anyone would. The Pinkertons think they have made their point. In the chaos, with the robbery collapsing and the gang trapped inside the bank, they do not understand at first that Hosea is still breathing. That small survival does not make the robbery a success. It may even make it crueler. Lenny still dies in the flight across the rooftops, because Saint Denis is not finished taking from the gang. John is still captured. The money is still lost. Dutch, Arthur, Bill, Javier, and Micah still stumble into the escape that leads toward the ship and then Guarma. Saint Denis still does what Saint Denis does. It proves that the gang has wandered into a world whose machinery is larger than their courage. Hosea living does not undo that. It simply leaves one candle burning in the room where the original story turns almost completely dark. The first hours after the failed robbery would be desperate and confused. The men who escaped the bank believe Hosea is dead because that is what they saw. The women, the older members, and those left behind in Lemoyne hear rumors before they hear facts. A body taken by Pinkertons, a wounded old outlaw under guard, a dead man not yet delivered to the morgue. Sadie Adler, already hardening into the person she will become, would not leave a rumor alone. Charles Smith would not either. Abigail, terrified for John and furious at every man who called this plan necessary, would understand exactly what Hosea's survival could mean. It would mean one more elder still alive, one more person who might keep Jack's world from collapsing entirely. The rescue of Hosea would not be grand in the way Dutch likes. It would not have speeches. It would not be a glorious charge down a street. It would be quieter, uglier, and more useful. Charles tracking a wagon route, Sadie finding which doctor or holding room the Pinkertons used, Abigail listening at doors because people underestimate women who look like they are simply waiting, Tilly and Mary Beth passing messages with more bravery than the men often give them credit for, maybe Susan Grimshaw, stern and unshakable, holding the temporary camp together while everyone learns how much of the family has been cut open. Hosea survives because the people Dutch often calls his family finally act like one without waiting for Dutch to tell them how. That matters. In the original story, after Saint Denis, the survivors outside the Guarma group are forced to relocate under pressure, and Sadie and Charles become the practical spine of the camp. If Hosea is wounded but alive with them, that spine becomes stronger and stranger. Sadie brings force. Charles brings discipline and moral clarity. Hosea brings memory. He knows how Dutch thinks when Dutch is cornered. He knows which plans are real and which plans are theatre. He knows that if Dutch returns from the sea with fewer men, more trauma, and Micah still at his side, the camp will need more than a new location. It will need a defense against Dutch's panic. Hosea recovering in hiding would be one of the quietest and most powerful changes in the story. He would not wake as the old, quick-talking con man immediately. He would wake in pain, short of breath. Old in a way even Arthur had not fully wanted to see. Saint Denis would have taken something from him even without killing him. That is important because the best version of this what-if does not turn Hosea into an impossible savior. It lets him survive as a wounded man. He can still think, still read people, still speak, still plan, but he cannot run every errand or stand between every gun and every fool. Survival gives him more time, not more youth. While Dutch, Arthur, and the others are on Guarma, Hosea would hear the gang's silence like a verdict. He would know Dutch is alive because trouble has a way of not being finished with Dutch. He would also know that some part of the old gang has already died, even if bodies have not all been counted. Lenny gone, John captured, the bank ruined, the Pinkertons close, Jack still a child, Abigail nearly breaking from fear and anger, Sadie pacing like grief has become a blade. The older camp, the one that could sing at Horseshoe and pretend the future still had room, would be impossible to recover. The difference is that Hosea would not confuse impossible recovery with impossible responsibility. That is his great gift. Dutch sees the dream failing and tries to make the dream louder. Hosea sees the dream failing and starts looking for what can still be saved. In this version, while Dutch is absent, Hosea would begin the work Arthur later discovers for himself, separating the gang from the people trapped inside it. The gang as Dutch's vision may be dying. The people in it do not all have to die with it. He would start with the non-combatants because Hosea has always understood the practical truth beneath the romantic language. Mary Beth needs money and an exit, not one more speech about faith. Tilly needs protection from old dangers and new law. Pearson needs a way to live that does not depend on stolen cans and hunted meat. Reverend Swanson needs distance from the rot of camp, if he is ever going to become more than his shame. Abigail needs John alive, or, failing that, Jack safe. Jack needs a world where he is not taught that every adult crisis ends with a gun. Hosea would look at them and see not weakness but the actual moral test of the gang. A family that cannot protect its vulnerable people has no right to call itself family. By the time Dutch returns from Guarma, the camp would already feel different. Not safe, because safety is gone, but organized. Charles and Sadie would have moved people. Grimshaw would have maintained order. Hosea, pale and seated more often than standing, would have begun making lists that reach beyond money. Who can travel? Who can lie convincingly? Who has family elsewhere? Who can read? Who can work? Who needs a name changed? Who needs to leave before Dutch turns departure into betrayal? That is not dramatic outlaw work. It is better than dramatic outlaw work. It is the kind of work that saves people after dramatic men destroy the room. Dutch's return would therefore hit a wall he did not expect. In the original story, he comes back from Guarma changed and immediately begins pulling the gang toward Beaver Hollow, paranoia, and larger violence. In this version, he returns to find Hosea alive, wounded, and watching him. That one difference would disturb Dutch more than almost anything else. A dead Hosea can be mourned, mythologized, and used as fuel. A living Hosea can disagree. A dead friend becomes a banner. A living friend becomes a mirror. Dutch would embrace him first. Of course he would. He would laugh, perhaps too loudly, and call it a miracle. He would make the survival part of the story of destiny, providence, fate, the universe refusing to finish them. He would talk about how they had all been tested and still remained. He would need Hosea's survival to mean that the plan still had divine permission. But Hosea would know Dutch well enough to hear the hunger inside that interpretation. Dutch wants his friend alive, but he also wants his friend alive in a way that proves Dutch is still right. Hosea would not give him that gift easily. He would be gentle at first because he loves Dutch. That love matters. Their bond is not fake. They built something together, even if that something became corrupted by time, pride, and violence. Hosea knew Dutch when the dream still had warmth in it. He knew the younger man who could talk a stranger into hope, the thief who could share stolen money, the outlaw who could make lost people feel seen. Hosea's tragedy is that he remembers enough good to make leaving difficult, and enough bad to make staying unbearable. Their first private conversation after Guarma would be one of the great unwritten scenes. Dutch describing storms, revolution, betrayal, survival, one more plan. Hosea, sitting with a blanket around his shoulders, breathing carefully, letting Dutch exhaust the performance before answering. He would not begin by calling Dutch mad. Hosea is too smart for that. He would begin with facts. John is in prison. Lenny is dead. The bank was a setup. The Pinkertons are too close. The camp cannot carry another major robbery. The women and Jack need to be moved away from the center. The sick and frightened cannot be used as scenery for Dutch's courage. Dutch would bristle at the word used, even if Hosea never said it harshly. Dutch hates being seen as someone who uses people, because his self-image depends on being the man who liberates them. That is where Hosea's survival becomes dangerous to Dutch. Arthur can challenge Dutch from the position of a son. Hosea challenges him from the position of an equal. A son's doubt can be dismissed as confusion. An equal's doubt is harder to explain away, without revealing how little equality remains. Micah would understand that immediately. Micah's power after Saint Denis grows from absence. Hosea dead, Linde dead, John captured, Arthur ill, Dutch shaken. He moves into the open space like smoke finding a room. If Hosea lives, the space is smaller. Micah cannot flatter Dutch without being watched by a man who knows the old rhythms of Dutch's vanity. He cannot sneer at caution as easily when the caution comes from the co-founder of the gang. He cannot turn every concern into cowardice when Hosea has bled in the street for the same family. That does not mean Micah becomes powerless. He is too adaptable for that. He would change tactics. With Hosea alive, Micah would not attack him directly at first. He would pity him. He would call him old without saying old too loudly. He would suggest the wound has made him fearful. He would speak to Bill and Javier about how hard it must be for Hosea, how painful it is to see a great man past his edge. He would plant the idea that Hosea's caution is not wisdom anymore, but decline. That is the kind of poison Micah prefers, a thought someone else can repeat later as if it came from them. Hosea would hear the poison even when it was spoken in other mouths. He has lived too long by lies not to smell one near the fire. But detecting Micah is not the same as removing him. Dutch protects Micah because Micah gives Dutch a version of himself without shame. Micah tells Dutch that violence is clarity, that doubt is betrayal, that loyalty means obedience, and that the world is so rotten there is no point pretending kindness matters. Hosea's survival creates conflict, but it does not automatically cure Dutch of wanting the easier voice. Arthur's return from Guarma would be changed too. In the original story, Arthur comes back to a camp already sliding toward a shape he does not recognize, with Hosea gone and Dutch leaning harder toward Micah. In this version, Arthur returns exhausted, coughing, sunburned by disaster, and finds Hosea alive. That moment would hit him harder than he expects. Arthur is not a man who cries easily in front of others, but the sight of Hosea breathing, even badly, would loosen something in him. He has lost enough fathers in his life. One coming back from the edge would feel almost impossible. Hosea would see Arthur's sickness sooner than Dutch does, and differently. Dutch sees Arthur's illness mostly through inconvenience, doubt, and later accusation. Hosea would see the way Arthur stands, the breath held too long, the cough swallowed down, the old strength becoming effort. He would not need the doctor's diagnosis to know something is wrong. Hosea has been ill before, grieving before, worn down by age and bad roads. He would not romanticize Arthur's body. He would know a man can be dying while still doing chores for everyone else. Their conversation about sickness would be quiet. Hosea would not force tenderness by making it too direct. He might ask if Arthur has seen a doctor. Arthur might lie. Hosea might let the lie sit between them for a moment, not because he believes it, but because he knows Arthur needs the dignity of not being cornered. Then Hosea would say something practical. Rest when you can. Eat. Stop taking every job Dutch throws like it is proof of love. Think about what John and Abigail need. Think about what the boy needs. A dying man should not spend his last strength funding another man's fantasy. That is a sentence Arthur might not be ready to accept, but Hosea living would make him hear it earlier. In the original story, Arthur's redemption grows from illness, guilt, Sister Calderon or Reverend Swanson, rains fall, John, Abigail, Sadie, Charles, and the collapse of his faith in Dutch. Hosea surviving adds another voice to that choir, and a very important one, the voice of the man who helped raise Arthur inside the gang, now telling him that loyalty may require disobedience. That would cut deeper than any sermon. John's imprisonment becomes the next major test. In the original story, Arthur and Sadie rescue John from Sisika against Dutch's wishes, and Dutch treats that act like a challenge to his authority. If Hosea lives, the argument starts earlier and in public. Hosea would not allow Dutch to talk around John forever. John is family. John was captured because the Saint Denis plan failed. Abigail is falling apart. Jack is waiting. Leaving John in prison to preserve some vague plan is not strategy. It is cowardice dressed as timing. Dutch would say they need to be careful. Hosea would agree, and that agreement would make his disagreement sharper. Careful does not mean idle. Careful means planning a rescue properly. Charles can scout. Sadie can move unseen in ways the law does not expect. Arthur can handle the hardest ride if his lungs let him. Hosea can arrange false information, a distraction, a bribed contact, a story that pulls attention away from the island. Dutch likes grand rescues when he can stand at the center of them. Hosea would design a rescue where Dutch is not needed, and that would be the insult. Would Dutch permit it? Perhaps not fully. He might refuse in words while allowing enough ambiguity to deny responsibility later. That is very Dutch. If it succeeds, he can say he trusted them. If it fails, he can say they disobeyed him. Hosea would recognize the move and proceed anyway. That is one of the biggest differences in this version. The rebellion against Dutch's authority becomes less lonely for Arthur. He is not simply a son breaking from a father. He is part of a quieter council of people who understand the father has become dangerous. John's rescue with Hosea in the background would change John's future too. John has always had complicated feelings about the gang, Dutch, Arthur, Hosea, and his own responsibilities. If Hosea helps bring him out, John would understand sooner that Dutch's family language no longer matches Dutch's choices. Arthur would still be the one pushing John toward escape, but Hosea's survival would give that advice an older authority. John might argue less. He might still be stubborn, ashamed, and slow to accept that leaving can be honorable. But Hosea would be living proof that the old founders are no longer united behind Dutch's dream. Abigail would feel that change immediately. She trusts results more than speeches, and Hosea has always been one of the few men in camp who can talk with her without treating her worry as a nuisance. If he helps get John back, Abigail's loyalty would move away from Dutch decisively. She would still fear the law. She would still be angry at John. She would still know that survival is not as simple as riding off with no money. But Hosea would become an ally in the practical work of escape. That matters because Abigail's instincts are often right before the men admit it. Hosea surviving means someone older finally listens to her. The camp at this point would no longer be one family. It would be two futures sharing a fire. Dutch's future is still one more score, one more noise, one more proof that he has not been beaten. Hosea's future is exit routes, cash divided quietly, people sent away before loyalty becomes a death sentence. Arthur stands between them for a while, because Arthur's heart has been trained to stand between people. But sickness pushes him toward decision. John and Abigail need time. Jack needs distance. Tilly and Mary Beth need safety. The Reverend needs a road out. Pearson needs permission to be ordinary. These are not side concerns, they are the point. The Cornwall confrontation becomes another key branch. In the original story, Dutch kills Leviticus Cornwall in Annesburg, a public, reckless act that shows how far his need for dominance has outrun strategy. If Hosea is alive, he would argue hard against it. Cornwall is dangerous, yes. Cornwall funds pressure, hires men, represents the industrial power crushing the gang's world. But killing him in public does not free anyone. It sharpens the noose. Hosea would see that immediately. He would say, in his way, that a dead rich man makes more noise than a living one if killed badly. Dutch might still do it. That is the bitter truth. Hosea surviving does not mean Dutch remains reachable in every moment. The closer Dutch gets to feeling cornered, the more he mistakes violence for control. If Hosea fails to stop Cornwall's murder, the failure becomes devastating because it proves that advice no longer holds Dutch the way it once did. Hosea would not be shocked by Dutch's capacity for violence. He has seen violence for decades. He would be shocked by the emptiness after it, by the way Dutch turns murder into rhetoric before the blood has even cooled. Arthur seeing Hosea fail to stop Dutch would be important. In the original story, Arthur spends much of the late game wondering whether Dutch has changed or whether Arthur is finally seeing him clearly. Hosea living gives Arthur a witness he trusts. If Hosea looks shaken after Cornwall, Arthur cannot dismiss his own doubts as sickness or disloyalty. The old man sees it too. The dream is not simply under pressure from outside. It is being damaged from within by the man who speaks its name most often. The Wapiti storyline would change in tone as well. Dutch uses eagle flies in the conflict with the army as a way to create noise and distraction. Arthur grows increasingly troubled by this, especially through Rain's fall, whose grief and restraint expose the ugliness of Dutch's manipulation. Hosea would be firmly on Rain's fall's side emotionally. Even if he understands the practical desperation of the gang, he would see an old pattern. Dutch turning another people's pain into material for his own escape story. Hosea might not be able to stop eagle flies from acting. Young men in pain do not always listen to old men telling them patience is not surrender. But Hosea could help Arthur and Charles resist Dutch more openly. He could tell Arthur that Rain's fall is not a fool for wanting peace. He could remind Dutch that using another man's son to distract the army is not rebellion, it is exploitation. Dutch would hate that word because it cuts too close to what he claims to oppose. Hosea would use it anyway, perhaps softly, which would make it worse. This could save eagle flies, though not easily. The story might bend toward a version where the refinery conflict still happens because pressure from the army, Cornwall's world, and eagle flies' anger remains. But Hosea's survival could place Arthur and Charles in position sooner, more prepared to pull eagle flies back from the worst of Dutch's bait. Maybe eagle flies is still wounded but not killed. Maybe Rain's fall still loses land, hope, and trust in the American promise, but not his son. That would not make the storyline happy. It would make it less cruel by one breath. And that is the pattern of this what if. Hosea living does not transform Red Dead Redemption 2 into a victory. It subtracts some cruelties, redirects some choices, and reveals some truths earlier. The century is still closing. The Pinkertons still hunt. The gang is still guilty of too much. Arthur is still sick. Dutch is still proud. Micah is still poison. But Hosea's presence creates more moments where someone can choose before the disaster becomes total. In a tragedy, one extra choice can matter, even if it cannot save the whole world. Micah would feel that threat more than anyone. His betrayal, according to Milton in the original story, begins after Guama. If that remains true here, then Hosea is alive precisely when Micah becomes most dangerous. Hosea would not know immediately. He would suspect. Suspicion in Hosea is quiet. He would watch who leaves camp at odd times, who pushes for plans that expose everyone, who benefits when Dutch distrusts Arthur, who laughs when people are afraid. Micah's problem is that he cannot help showing contempt. A better liar would imitate loyalty more carefully. Micah enjoys poisoning the well too much. Hosea might set a trap with information. Not a loud trap, a small one. He could tell different people different pieces of a planned move, a fake stash, a false meeting, a supposed contact in Van Horn or Annesburg. Then he would wait to see which version the Pinkertons seem to know. This is the kind of con Hosea understands better than Dutch. Dutch likes dramatic deception. Hosea likes diagnostic deception, a lie designed not to make money, but to reveal who repeats it. Would the trap expose Micah cleanly? Maybe not at first. Micah is cunning when survival is on the line, and the Pinkertons are not foolish. But the pressure would build. Arthur would begin watching too. Grimshaw, who already has a hard instinct for camp loyalty, might notice shifts in Micah's movements. Sadie would not need much evidence to want him dead. Charles would wait for proof, because Charles understands the cost of acting too early. The camp would become a place where two investigations unfold at once. Pinkertons hunting the gang from outside, and Hosea hunting the leak from within. That internal hunt would make Beaver Hollow different. In the original story, Beaver Hollow feels like spiritual burial. The gang moves into a cave system associated with the Murphree brood, damp, dark, ugly, and wrong. It is one of the clearest environmental signs that Dutch's dream has gone underground. If Hosea survives, he would resist that move with every bit of strength he has left. He would understand what a camp does to morale. Horseshoe looked over open land. Clemens Point had water and light. Shady Bell was decaying, but still a house. Beaver Hollow is a grave pretending to be shelter. Dutch might still choose it, because Dutch late in the story is drawn to places that match his siege mentality. A cave gives him the feeling of defense, secrecy, and last stands. Hosea would see the same cave and think of sickness, fear, and people losing the will to leave. So perhaps the gang splits physically before it splits violently. Dutch, Micah, Bill, Javier, and the men still committed to the next score may use Beaver Hollow as the armed centre. Hosea, Arthur, Charles, Sadie, Abigail, Jack, and the people planning exits may keep a secondary camp or safe house elsewhere, shifting between old cabins, sympathetic contacts, and the edges of Roanoke. That split would be one of the most important changes. In the original story, the gang breaks emotionally before it breaks physically. Everyone is still around the same campfire as trust collapses. With Hosea alive, the split becomes more organized. Not clean, not announced as rebellion, but real. Dutch would hate it because it makes visible what he wants to deny. People are already leaving him. Hosea would frame it as practical safety. Too many people in one place draws law. Children should not sleep near a cave full of armed paranoia. Sick men need air. Women need options. All true. Also all a quiet vote of no confidence. Javier's position would become sadder in this version. He respects the old ideals. He believes in loyalty, and Hosea is part of the gang's old moral architecture. If Hosea stands against Dutch's worst decisions, Javier cannot simply tell himself that only Arthur has become doubtful. He has to see the older split. That might delay his fall toward Dutch's side or make his eventual choice more painful. Javier is not Micah. He does not delight in rot. He clings to Dutch because Dutch gave him belonging and a cause. Hosea surviving forces him to ask whether the cause still lives in Dutch or in the people Dutch is ignoring. Bill would struggle differently. Bill often needs certainty more than truth. Dutch gives certainty. Micah gives bluntness. Hosea gives nuance. And nuance can feel like weakness to a frightened man who wants a strong voice. Hosea might be kinder to Bill than Arthur often is, but kindness would not necessarily reach him. Bill's loyalty might remain with Dutch, because Dutch's version of family demands less thinking. That is tragic but believable. Hosea can offer a door. He cannot make everyone walk through it. Susan Grimshaw would become one of Hosea's strongest allies. She is harsh, sometimes cruel, and deeply shaped by the gang's old discipline, but she cares about the camp as a living household. She understands that family is more than ideology. It is chores, food, order, protection, and consequences. Micah offends everything she represents. In the original story, she stands with Arthur at the end and is killed for it. In this version, Hosea's presence may keep her from standing alone too late. The old guard would have more than one voice. The women of the gang would benefit most from Hosea's survival, not because he saves them like a hero, but because he validates what many of them already know. Mary Beth understands the power of stories and the danger of believing the wrong one. Tilly understands survival under male violence and false belonging. Karen, if she can still be reached, understands grief that has turned to drink after Sean's death. Abigail understands that Dutch's dream has become a threat to her son. Hosea would listen to these truths more than Dutch does. He would not listen perfectly, because he is still a man of his time and life, but he would listen enough for the story to change. Arthur's relationship with Sadie would also shift. In the original late game, Sadie becomes one of Arthur's strongest allies because both of them are operating outside Dutch's moral collapse. With Hosea alive, Sadie gains an older strategist who respects action but understands cost. She might still want to tear through every enemy in front of her. Hosea would not try to make her gentle. He would help her aim. That is an important distinction. Sadie does not need to be softened to matter. She needs people who can see her grief without using it. Hosea's guilt over Saint Denis would become one of the story's quiet engines. He found the bank lead. He helped persuade Dutch that the job could be done. He did not create the trap, and he did not make Milton pull the trigger, but Hosea is too honest in private to pretend the plan has nothing to do with him. A worse man would survive that street and immediately turn his wound into innocence. Hosea would do the opposite. He would lie to others when useful, but he has never been quite as skilled at lying to himself as Dutch is. That guilt would haunt him especially because Lenny dies in the same collapse. Lenny represents something Hosea values deeply: intelligence, youth, humor, and a future that might have outgrown outlaw life if given time. Hosea has seen young men die before, but Lenny's death is different because Lenny had the kind of mind Hosea respected. He could read, argue, learn, and see through foolishness. Losing him on a Saint Denis rooftop would make Hosea's survival feel almost indecent to him. the old man lives, the young man falls. Red Dead often arranges grief that way, and it never feels fair. Hosea would carry that unfairness into every plan afterward. When Dutch speaks of needing one more score, Hosea would hear Lenny's body hitting the roof. When Micah mocks caution, Hosea would hear the gunfire around the bank. When Bill grumbles that people are losing nerve, Hosea would think of a boy who did not get to become an old man. His caution would not come from fear of death. It would come from having seen the wrong people die for the wrong reasons. That is a different kind of wisdom from the one Hosea has earlier in the game. At Horseshoe and Clemens Point, Hosea's wisdom still has play in it. He can enjoy the con. He can laugh through a false name. He can walk into a Braithwaite parlour and make deception feel almost like theatre. After Saint Denis, the theatre would remain, but the laughter would be thinner. He would still use tricks, but less for the pleasure of being clever, and more for the purpose of keeping another young person from a bullet. The Saint Denis wound would also change his relationship with risk. Hosea has never been a coward, but he has always preferred crimes where no one needs to die. That preference becomes harder after the bank, because the old method failed. The con did not save them. The distraction did not save him. The clever old man was still dragged into the street. A lesser version of Hosea might take that as proof that subtlety is useless and Dutch's noise is necessary. The better version understands the opposite. Subtlety failed once because the whole gang had become too loud already. The answer is not louder violence. The answer is less faith in grand operations. He would begin thinking in smaller units. 2 people leaving at night instead of 20 people fleeing after a shootout. $10 passed quietly instead of $1,000 stolen from a bank. A contact in a town who can arrange papers. A horse sold under a false name. A woman and a child sent ahead before the men finish arguing. These are not the gestures that legends remember, but Hosea has lived long enough to distrust legends. A legend can keep men warm for a while. A ticket, a coat, and a little cash can keep someone alive. Arthur would understand that shift, because his own morality is becoming smaller and therefore truer. Early Arthur thinks in gang terms. Protect camp, earn money, follow Dutch, do the job. Late Arthur thinks in human terms. Help John, help Abigail, help Jack, help the Downs family if he can. Help rains fall where possible. Give one person a chance, even if the world remains broken. Hosea surviving would bring that human scale into focus sooner. The 2 men would meet in the same place from different directions. Arthur through sickness, Hosea through age and regret. Their shared grief for Lenny would matter too. Arthur and Lenny's drunken night in Valentine is one of the story's warmest memories, full of foolishness and laughter before the world hardens. Hosea would remember Lenny differently, as a bright mind inside a camp that too often rewarded brawn and obedience. Together, Arthur and Hosea could mourn him without turning him into a slogan. Dutch would say Lenny died for the cause, because Dutch needs every death to support the myth. Hosea would know Lenny died because the plan went bad, and because the gang kept confusing courage with escalation. That difference in mourning matters deeply. Dutch uses the dead as fuel. Hosea would use the dead as warning. The same grave can produce very different futures depending on who speaks over it. If Dutch names Lenny and Hosea as proof that the gang must strike back harder, the dead become ammunition. If Hosea names them as proof that the living must leave sooner, the dead become a warning bell. Arthur would slowly move toward Hosea's way of mourning, because Arthur is beginning to understand that revenge can be another form of waste. Hosea's survival also changes how the gang talks about Blackwater. The Blackwater money hangs over the entire story like a ghost chest, a promise of escape that remains physically close and practically unreachable. Dutch uses it as part of the dream. The stash exists, therefore the future exists. Hosea would be more honest. Money left behind in a locked-down town under heavy law is not a plan. It is bait for desperate men. The more Dutch talks about recovering it, the more Hosea would hear a man trying to return to the original wound and call that healing. In this version, Hosea might tell Arthur that Blackwater is less important than Dutch's need for Blackwater to matter. That is a sharp thought. The stash is valuable, but its symbolic value is even more dangerous. If Dutch can get it, he can pretend the disaster was temporary. If he cannot get it, he can keep promising that the true plan is still waiting behind the law. Either way, Blackwater lets him avoid admitting that the gang's life has become unsustainable. Hosea would want Arthur to see that a future built around unreachable money is not a future, it is a leash. The same applies to Tahiti. Hosea might once have smiled at the absurdity of Dutch's paradise talk, letting it pass because every outlaw family needs a dream while the stew is thin and the law is near. After Saint Denis, he would no longer indulge it. Tahiti has become less a destination than a sedative. Dutch says it, and frightened people breathe easier for a moment. That is the danger. A dream can comfort people enough to keep them from walking toward a real exit. Hosea would begin treating Tahiti almost as a symptom of Dutch's illness, a beautiful word used to delay practical decisions. Arthur would likely laugh at that in his dry way, because he has been mocking Tahiti for some time. But Hosea would push deeper than mockery. It is easy to make fun of the mangoes and the tropical fantasy, harder to admit that the gang has always survived partly on invented horizons. The West, freedom, one more score, a place no law can reach. Hosea helped sell some of those horizons too. His survival would force him to confess, perhaps only to Arthur, that he and Dutch spent years teaching people to believe in exits they had not actually built. That confession would be one of the most mature moments in the alternate story. Hosea is not innocent. He is charming, beloved, wise, and guilty. He has robbed, lied, manipulated, and helped build a gang that eventually consumed the lives of people who trusted it. His survival does not erase that. It gives him time to take responsibility in a way Dutch cannot. He can say, "I helped make this." He can say, "I was wrong to think we could keep dancing between kindness and violence forever." He can say, "Maybe the best thing left is to help people leave the thing I helped build." That is the reason Hosea's continued presence would not weaken Arthur's arc. It would deepen it. Arthur's redemption is powerful because he does not become innocent. He becomes honest about being guilty and chooses better anyway. Hosea would mirror that on an older scale. A young man dying of disease and an old man dying by inches from age, grief, and a bullet wound could both realize that the final moral task is not self-exoneration. It is useful repair. One of the strongest new scenes would be Hosea with Abigail after John's rescue. Abigail would not be polite with him, and that is part of why the scene would matter. She would thank him perhaps, but then she would ask why it took so long for the old men to understand what she had been saying for years. John is a fool, but he is her fool. Jack is a child. The camp's speeches do not feed them. The plans do not protect them. Dutch's love always seems to arrive after danger has already been allowed in. Hosea would not defend himself much. He would have the grace to let her anger stand. Abigail's anger is one of the cleanest moral forces in the story. It is not refined, not gentle, not always fair in the moment, but it is aimed at life. She wants her son safe. She wants John to grow up. She wants the men around her to stop treating danger like weather. Hosea surviving means Abigail's anger finally has an elder who does not simply absorb it and move on. He would act on it. That gives Abigail more agency in the alternate story, because her warnings become part of the escape plan instead of background tension. Hosea and Jack would create another tender contrast. Jack knows Hosea as one of the gentler men in camp, someone with stories, tricks, and a kind face shaped by sadness. If Hosea survives Saint Denis, Jack also grows up around the aftermath of a man nearly killed by the life everyone keeps calling family. Children notice what adults try to hide. Jack would notice Hosea walking slower, coughing differently, sleeping more. He might ask if the city hurt him. Hosea, being Hosea, might turn the answer into a little story about foolish old men and streets that bite. That little story would matter because Hosea is one of the few people who can tell a child the truth without handing him the whole horror. Dutch talks to children like props in his dream. John often struggles to speak to Jack at all. Arthur can be sweet but awkward, as if tenderness must pass through his hands before reaching his voice. Hosea has the old conman's gift of shaping a story to fit the room. He could tell Jack that some roads are not meant to be followed just because men shout about them. He could plant a warning gently enough that Jack remembers the feeling before he understands the meaning. Mary Beth would respond to Hosea's survival in a different way. She is a storyteller, and storytellers notice when the story changes shape. A dead Hosea becomes a tragic chapter in Dutch's legend. A living Hosea becomes a critic of the legend. Mary Beth might be one of the first to understand that this matters. She has a romantic imagination, but she is not stupid. She can see when romance becomes a cage. Hosea might encourage her writing in a more direct way after Saint Denis, not as a pretty hobby, but as an exit. Words can become a road out if someone has the courage to follow them. Tilly's future would also become more secure under Hosea's quiet planning. Tilly has survived the Foreman brothers, survived violence, and built dignity inside a camp that is not always safe in the ways it claims to be. Hosea would know that Tilly needs more than a handful of money at the last second. She needs a route, perhaps a contact, perhaps a city where she can disappear among people and not be easily dragged back into old danger. In the original future, Tilly does well. In this alternate version, her departure could feel less like luck and more like the result of people finally treating her survival as a priority. Karen is harder. By the late story, her grief over Sean and her drinking make her future feel like one of the gang's unresolved tragedies. Hosea living might help, but not with certainty. He can speak to grief because he knows it. He can sit beside someone who drinks because he drank hard after Bessie. He might see that Karen is not simply careless or embarrassing. She is a woman falling through a hole the camp does not know how to close. Maybe he reaches her enough to send her away with Tilly or Mary Beth. Maybe he fails. A top-tier what-if should allow some doors to remain painfully uncertain. Reverend Swanson would recognize Hosea's survival as a kind of unwanted grace. Swanson's own arc is about shame, addiction, and eventually leaving the gang's orbit. Hosea might speak with him less like a preacher and more like a fellow ruined man. Both know what it is to fail their own ideals. Both know the strange embarrassment of being offered another day when one has wasted many. Hosea could encourage Swanson's departure without mockery, understanding that redemption sometimes looks like catching a train before the people who need drama notice you have gone. Pearson, practical and often comic, would receive from Hosea perhaps the plainest mercy, permission to become ordinary. Pearson is not built for the final madness. He can cook, complain, reminisce, and survive if removed from the myth in time. Hosea would understand that there is no shame in a man becoming a shopkeeper if the alternative is dying for Dutch's pride. In fact, Hosea might envy him. An ordinary counter, ordinary shelves, ordinary customers, ordinary complaints. After enough outlaw grandeur, ordinary life can look almost holy. Uncle would complicate everything in his usual way. He is lazy, funny, irritating, and oddly durable. Hosea would not waste much strategy on making Uncle noble. He would simply account for him the way one accounts for weather, bad roads, or a horse with opinions. Yet even Uncle benefits from the exits Hosea builds. The future at Beecher's Hope needs people who remember the old world without entirely worshipping it. Uncle, for all his flaws, helps make John's ranch feel less like a monument and more like a lived-in mess. Hosea would understand the value of that mess. Charles's respect for Hosea would deepen after Saint Denis, because Charles values people who match words with restraint. He has little patience for cruelty pretending to be strength. Hosea, wounded and still planning for others, would earn his trust in a way Dutch increasingly cannot. Their partnership would be understated. Hosea sees roots through people. Charles sees roots through land. Hosea knows when a lie will open a door. Charles knows when a track is too fresh or a camp too exposed. Together, they could keep more of the family alive than either could alone. This partnership would matter, especially around Roanoke Ridge. The land itself changes the mood of the story. The forests tighten. The roads feel watched. The Murfree brood make even isolation feel contaminated. Dutch sees the region as cover. Charles sees the danger in the soil and the people. Hosea would listen to Charles because Hosea is not too proud to respect expertise. If Charles says a place is wrong, Hosea would not dismiss it as nerves. This could prevent the gang from fully surrendering its soul to Beaver Hollow's darkness, even if Dutch insists on using it as his armed whole. Sadie and Charles together already become the camp's survival engine after Guarma. Hosea living turns that engine into a council. Sadie asks what must be done. Charles asks what is right and practical. Hosea asks what story the enemy believes and how to use that against them. Arthur, when present, brings force and conscience in one tired body. This is the alternate leadership group Dutch fears without naming. It does not need to overthrow him to prove he is no longer necessary. It only needs to solve problems he keeps making worse. That is why Dutch would become more theatrical around them. When a leader senses practical competence moving elsewhere, he often turns up the volume of symbolic authority. More speeches, more demands for faith, more reminders of what he has done for everyone. More accusations that doubt helps the enemy. Hosea's survival would draw this out of Dutch earlier. The conflict becomes not merely Dutch versus Arthur, but Dutch's performance versus the quiet competence of people who have stopped clapping. Micah would exploit that by calling the council a conspiracy. He would imply Arthur and Hosea are undermining Dutch. He would suggest Sadie is unstable, Charles is too independent, Abigail is manipulating John, and Grimshaw is clinging to old authority. He would not need to prove all of it. He would only need to give Dutch words for the insecurity already growing inside him. Micah's finest talent is not persuasion in the elegant sense. It is giving ugly feelings permission to speak. Hosea would likely see that too late to prevent all damage, but early enough to understand the battlefield. The fight for the gang is no longer about money. It is about who gets to define loyalty. Dutch defines loyalty as faith in him. Hosea begins defining loyalty as protection of the people. Arthur eventually accepts Hosea's definition. Micah's entire survival depends on Dutch's definition winning. Once that is clear, every late-game argument becomes part of the same moral war. The strange sadness is that Hosea may blame himself for Dutch's definition of loyalty. He helped build the gang around charisma, brotherhood, shared danger, and the feeling of being chosen by one another against the world. That feeling saved people at first. It gave Arthur a home, John a second chance, Tilly shelter, Javier belonging, and many others a place to stand. But a family built around a charismatic center can become dangerous when the center demands worship. Hosea may realize that the old warmth contained the seed of the later trap. That realization would not make him cynical about love. It would make him more careful about love's structure. A healthy family lets people leave. A cult calls leaving betrayal. A healthy leader can be wrong. A false prophet turns correction into treason. Hosea's late wisdom would be the ability to say that the gang became dangerous precisely because it began with real affection. Fake families do not hurt this much when they break. Real ones do. Arthur would need to hear that. He is haunted by the fear that his whole life has been wasted on a lie. Hosea can tell him the harder, kinder truth. It was not all lie, and that is why it worked. Dutch did save people. Dutch did teach Arthur to read in some emotional sense, to believe he was more than a street orphan, to stand against certain kinds of cruelty. Hosea did too. The tragedy is that good beginnings do not guarantee good endings. A man can once be a rescuer and later become a danger. Accepting that allows Arthur to leave without needing to pretend he never loved him. The same truth would shape Hosea's last view of Dutch. Hosea would not hate him simply. Hatred would be easier. He would grieve the young man on the road to Chicago, the quick laugh, the charm, the early robberies that felt almost clean compared with later blood, the campfires where ideals had not yet hardened into excuses. But grief would not stop judgment. Hosea can love Dutch and still say he has become unsafe. That combination is morally adult, in a way Dutch's late speeches are not. If the alternate story were shown through camp atmosphere, the changes would be subtle at first. More whispers around Hosea's tent, more people asking him instead of Dutch about when to move, Abigail and Grimshaw speaking quietly near the wagons, Charles returning from scouting and reporting to Hosea before Dutch, Sadie cleaning a gun while listening to an old man's plan, Arthur sitting nearby saying little, absorbing the fact that another order is forming inside the ruins of the old one. Dutch would notice and smile too tightly. Camp songs would fade differently too. In the original, the music and warmth of early chapters slowly disappear as the gang rots. With Hosea alive, perhaps there are still small attempts at warmth, not because things are better, but because Hosea understands morale as survival. A cup of coffee shared with Tilly, a story for Jack, a joke thrown at Pearson, a quiet word to Karen. These little gestures cannot restore Horseshoe, but they resist Beaver Hollow. They keep people from becoming only fugitives. This matters because Dutch, late in the story, confuses intensity with life. The louder the danger, the more alive he seems to feel. Hosea understands that life is often quiet maintenance. Food, rest, clean bandages, a route away from patrols, a child distracted from fear, a woman given honest warning, a young man told not to throw himself into a doomed fight. The alternate story becomes a conflict between two definitions of being alive. Dutch wants glory under pressure. Hosea wants people breathing tomorrow. One of the most interesting altered scenes would involve Molly. In the original story, Molly drunkenly claims betrayal and is killed by Grimshaw, though later evidence indicates she did not actually inform. Hosea surviving might change that moment profoundly. He knows loneliness. He knows performance. He knows that people sometimes tell destructive lies because being ignored has become unbearable. If Molly staggers into camp making her claim, Hosea might hear the theatrical pain under it before the gun fires. Could he save her? Perhaps. Grimshaw acts fast, shaped by camp lore and fear. But Hosea's presence might slow the room by 1 second, and 1 second can matter. He might step in, voice sharp enough to cut through the panic, asking what exactly Molly told, when, to whom. A liar with a death wish often cannot answer specifics. Micah, notably, would want her dead quickly because a false confession helps hide the real informant. Hosea, noticing that urgency, could change everything. If Molly survives, the camp's moral atmosphere shifts again. Dutch is forced to confront the pain he caused her without the convenience of her immediate death. Grimshaw is spared the burden of killing a woman for a lie. Micah loses a useful distraction. Arthur sees yet another example of Hosea slowing violence long enough for truth to breathe. Molly might still leave broken-hearted and bitter, but leaving is different from being shot into silence. This is one of the ways Hosea's survival could save people at the edges of the main plot, where the original tragedy is often brutal and fast. The false confession also gives Hosea another clue about Micah. If Molly did not know enough, and if the Pinkertons still know too much, then the real leak remains. Hosea would understand misdirection. He would ask who benefits from Molly's death. He would watch Micah's satisfaction, Dutch's shame, and the way fear makes everyone eager for the simplest answer. A good conman knows that a crowd often wants the wrong culprit, because the wrong culprit is emotionally convenient. Molly is convenient. Micah is useful to Dutch. That contrast would trouble Hosea deeply. The Linde attack would also change under Hosea's planning. In the original story, the Pinkertons descend with overwhelming force after the gang returns from Guarma, proving again that they are not hidden enough. If Hosea has been testing information and moving non-combatants earlier, the attack may find fewer vulnerable people in one place. The shootout still happens because Milton and Ross are relentless, but its cost might be reduced. Jack may already be away. Mary Beth and Tilly may have been sent out on errands that are really exits. Pearson may have supplies cached beyond the main camp. This is not glamorous, but it is exactly the kind of difference Hosea makes. He does not make the Pinkertons incompetent. He makes their competence less fatal to people who should not be standing in the blast radius. A lesser what if would have Hosea outsmart the entire agency and vanish in triumph. A better one lets him shave the edge off disaster. Sometimes wisdom is not preventing the storm. Sometimes wisdom is moving the children before the roof comes off. Hosea's near death would also affect how he sees Milton. In the original, Milton's killing of Hosea is public, cold, and strategic. If Hosea survives it, Milton becomes more than an enemy. He becomes the man who tried to turn Hosea's body into a message. Hosea would understand the tactic because he has used theatre all his life. Milton's theatre is lawful brutality. He wanted Dutch to see a founder fall and lose control. The plan worked in the original story. In this version, the performance misfires. The prop survives and begins interpreting the stage. That would make Milton more cautious if he learns Hosea is alive. A dead Hosea is useful. A living Hosea is dangerous because he can tell others what the Pinkertons want them to feel. Hosea could explain that Milton is not merely hunting them, he is trying to shape their reactions. Public executions, pressure on family, offers of deals, visible force, all of it is psychological. Dutch responds to psychological pressure by becoming grander. Hosea responds by becoming more precise. That contrast could save lives. Arthur would benefit from that precision when his own mind is clouded by sickness and disillusionment. Tuberculosis does not make him foolish, but it drains him. Pain and fatigue narrow a person's world. Hosea could help keep the larger map in view, not the literal map of states and roads, but the moral map. Who needs to leave first? Which choices are beyond repair? When confronting Dutch is useful, when it only feeds his drama, when to speak, when to move. Arthur's courage is immense, but courage under illness can spend itself too quickly. Hosea would help him spend it carefully. There would be a heartbreaking reversal in that. For years, Arthur has been the strong one doing the physical work while Hosea advises. Now Hosea is physically broken too, and Arthur is dying. Two damaged men trying to ration what remains of themselves. Their partnership would become less father and son, more two veterans of the same collapsing war, realizing that neither can carry the family alone. That equality would be new and tender. Arthur has often been treated as the gang's weapon. Hosea surviving helps him become, before the end, a fellow judge of what the weapon has been used for. This could also shift Arthur's honor path in a quiet way. The world still allows many versions of Arthur's choices, but Hosea's presence would gently pressure him toward the higher road, not through preaching, but through expectation. Hosea knows Arthur is better than his worst work. He also knows better than to flatter him cheaply. He might say, almost casually, that Arthur has always had a softness he tries to bury under chores and curses. Arthur would deny it. Hosea would smile and let him deny it. The seed would remain. When Arthur helps Edith Downes and Archie later, Hosea might not be directly involved, but his influence would sit behind the action. Arthur's guilt over Thomas Downes is deeply personal, and no one can process it for him. Yet Hosea's late advice about useful repair would give Arthur a frame for what he is doing. He cannot undo the debt collection. He cannot unspit the blood that infected him. He can get a woman and her son away from the ruin he helped cause. That is not forgiveness. It is direction. Hosea's own past with Bessie would make him understand the Downes thread from another angle. Losing a spouse changed his life. He tried to leave the outlaw world with Bessie and drifted back after she died. Edith Downes loses Thomas and is pushed into desperation, partly because of Strauss's loan and Arthur's violence. Hosea would see the dark mirror there. Grief can either push someone towards survival or drag them into the machinery of other people's choices. Arthur helping Edith would matter to Hosea because it is the kind of repair he wishes more men had done before the damage spread. Strauss becomes another interesting point. Arthur banishes Strauss in the original story after finally recognizing the cruelty of the debt work. Hosea surviving might make that confrontation earlier or more deliberate. Hosea has tolerated Strauss because the gang needs money and because charming outlaws often outsource uglier economies to quieter men. But after Saint Denis, Hosea may lose patience with any income that ruins the poor while pretending to be clean. He might not shout at Strauss. He might simply stop accepting the old excuse that numbers are neutral. Numbers can be knives if handed to desperate people. If Hosea supports Arthur in removing Strauss, that becomes a powerful symbolic break from the gang's old compromises. It says the new exit plan will not be funded by squeezing dying farmers and widows. It will use what the gang has, what can be sold, what can be stolen from those who can absorb loss, and what can be earned by leaving. This matters because a what-if where Hosea survives should not make him pure. It should let him become more honest about impurities he once tolerated. Dutch would see the removal of Strauss as another attack on his authority, even if he never cared much for the loan work emotionally. Late Dutch treats every independent moral choice as a challenge. If Arthur and Hosea decide Strauss has to go, Dutch hears that someone else is defining the gang's ethics. That frightens him, because his leadership depends on being the source of meaning. Hosea, by contrast, is learning that meaning can survive outside Dutch. That may be the deepest betrayal in Dutch's eyes. The relationship between Hosea and Javier deserves a little more room too. Javier is often remembered for where he stands at the end, but earlier he is warm, musical, loyal, and shaped by his own history of exile. Hosea would know that Javier's loyalty is not stupidity, it is gratitude and fear braided together. If Hosea tries to reach him after Saint Denis, the conversation would not be about Micah first. It would be about what kind of loyalty an honorable man owes when a leader begins using loyalty to cover harm. Javier might listen and still fail to move. That is the tragedy of him. He can respect Hosea and still choose Dutch because Dutch represents the family that took him in when the world had rejected him. Hosea's survival might make Javier raise his gun even higher, even more clearly away from Arthur and John, because his hesitation becomes more conscious. He knows enough to doubt. He lacks the courage or readiness to break. That makes his later fate in the first game feel heavier. He is not a man who never saw the door. He is a man who could not walk through it when it mattered. Bill, too, might have one unexpectedly human scene with Hosea. Hosea has mocked Bill, and Bill often deserves mockery, but Bill's fear of being useless is real. Micah exploits that. Dutch soothes it with belonging. Hosea might try, late, to tell Bill that staying with Dutch's worst choices will not make him respected. It will only make him convenient. Bill may not understand or may reject it angrily. Still, the attempt matters. Hosea's survival means even those who ultimately fall on the wrong side are given a clearer chance to choose. The phrase clearer chance is important because this alternate story should not remove moral responsibility. If Javier, Bill, or others remain with Dutch after Hosea's warnings, their choice becomes more tragic and more accountable. They cannot say no one told them. They cannot say Arthur alone had turned strange. They cannot say the old guard was silent. Hosea's living presence makes the final division less foggy. The fog remains, but a lantern has been raised inside it. Hosea himself would also have to choose between saving Dutch and saving everyone else. That may be his hardest private conflict. For decades, saving Dutch and saving the gang may have felt like the same work. Keep Dutch calm, keep the dream credible, Keep the plans clever. Keep the family moving. After Saint Denis, those goals separate. Saving Dutch may require all attention turned toward one proud man's unravelling. Saving everyone else requires accepting that Dutch may not come. Hosea's maturity is choosing the people who can still be led out. That choice would feel like a betrayal even if it is morally right. Hosea is not cold. He would grieve every step away from Dutch. He might still leave messages, still try private appeals, still hope one sentence will reach the man behind the performance. The hope would fade slowly, not vanish in one scene. That slow fading is more truthful. People rarely stop loving a ruined friend all at once. They learn, through repeated pain, that love cannot be allowed to drive the wagon anymore. If Hosea survives into the epilogue, his grief for Dutch remains unresolved. Dutch is not dead. He is out there, diminished and dangerous, carrying the ruins of himself. Hosea might hear rumours, a sighting in the mountains, a robbery with old style, a man speaking too beautifully around desperate people. Each rumour would hurt, because it confirms that Dutch has become a wandering remainder of the dream they built. Hosea's punishment is living long enough to know that some people do not die when they are lost. They keep moving. This creates a quiet parallel with Arthur's grave. Arthur gets a resting place, shaped by honour, mountain air, and the knowledge that he spent his last strength well. Dutch does not get that kind of rest in Hosea's mind. He remains unfinished. Micah remains unfinished until Mount Hagen. John remains unfinished until the law closes around him. Hosea's survival makes him a man surrounded by unfinished endings. That is why the letter image near the end feels right. Letters are unfinished speech. They travel where the speaker cannot safely go. There is also room for a small but meaningful change around Arthur's journal. Arthur preserves the world through sketches, observations, and private thoughts. Hosea living might encourage that, without ever making it sentimental. He could notice Arthur drawing and say that a man who draws a bird before robbing a train is not as simple as he pretends. Arthur would grunt, maybe insult him, maybe close the book, but Hosea would be right. The journal is evidence that Arthur has always been more witness than weapon. Hosea's survival helps Arthur trust the witness part before the end. That matters because witness is a form of resistance against Dutch. Dutch turns events into speeches that serve him. Arthur's journal turns events into observations that often outlive him. Hosea, as a conman, understands the power of narration, but late in life he begins valuing a quieter kind. Not the story that persuades, but the private account that refuses to flatter. Arthur's sketches of towns, animals, strangers, and camp life are closer to truth than Dutch's grand explanations. Hosea might see that and realize Arthur has been escaping the dream internally long before he escapes it openly. The alternate story could even include Hosea asking Arthur to write down where people go, not in a dangerous ledger, but in a way that someone trustworthy could understand later, if help is needed. Arthur would hate the idea at first because writing people's routes is risky. Hosea would agree, and tell him that memory is risky too when old men are dying. This little exchange would show both men thinking beyond themselves. The gang's old ledgers are about money. The new private list, if it exists at all, is about survival. The Pinkertons make all of this harder because they are not merely villains in hats. They represent the modern state's patience. Dutch treats them as enemies in a drama. Hosea sees them increasingly as weather systems with paperwork. They can lose a gunfight and come back with more men. They can miss one camp and search the next. They can follow bank loans, telegraph messages, informants, rail routes, and bodies. Fighting them as if they are another gang is foolish. Hosea's survival would push the story toward that realization earlier. That would create a strong contrast with Micah's worldview. Micah thinks survival belongs to the meanest and quickest. Hosea thinks survival belongs to those who understand systems. Micah can win a brawl, manipulate a frightened leader, and betray for advantage. Hosea can read the shape of pursuit, reputation, hunger, and fear. In the short term, Micah's brutality often looks stronger. In the long term, Hosea's understanding saves more people. The tragedy is that short-term brutality can still kill the wise before wisdom finishes its work. This is why the alternate timeline should allow Micah to remain dangerous to the end. If Hosea exposes him too early, and everyone simply believes it, the final act loses its pressure. A better version has Hosea narrow the circle, but not close it before Milton's revelation. He makes Micah uncomfortable. He protects people from some of Micah's worst suggestions. He gives Arthur language for the suspicion. But Micah remains close enough to Dutch to do damage, because Dutch's need keeps the door open. The true lock is not lack of evidence, it is Dutch's pride. The visual language of the late camps would become richer with Hosea alive. Imagine him at Shady Bell after the wound, surrounded by decaying gentility, old wallpaper, damp wood, and the ghosts of southern wealth. Then Lakay, with swamp air and insects, a hiding place that feels temporary by the minute. Then Roanoke, dark trees and wet stone, where the land seems to close around the survivors. Hosea's body would reflect these moves. Each camp costs him. Each road makes him older. The map is more than geography. It is the visible aging of the gang's last conscience. His clothes would matter too. Hosea is usually neat in his own worn way, an old performer who understands presentation. After Saint Denis, his vest may hang looser. His coat may be patched near the wound. His hat may not sit with quite the same jaunty intelligence. Yet he would still try to dress properly when planning a con or speaking to a contact, because dignity is one of the last tools he owns. That tiny effort would be moving. A man can be falling apart and still brush dust from his sleeve before lying to a banker. The con artistry after Saint Denis would become more morally focused. Earlier Hosea cons for money, survival, and sometimes pleasure. Later he might con the law to buy time for Tilly, con a clerk for travel information, con a stable owner into selling a horse quietly, con a telegraph operator into misdirecting a message. The skills are the same, the aim changes. That is redemption in Hosea's language. He does not become a saint. He uses old sins in the service of less sinful ends. That mirrors Arthur using violence differently near the end. Arthur does not become non-violent. He still fights, kills, and threatens when the story demands it. But the direction changes. Violence in service of Dutch's pride feels different from violence in service of Abigail's rescue or John's escape. Hosea's lies work the same way. A lie told to rob a desperate fool is ugly. A lie told to move a child past a checkpoint is mercy wearing a false moustache. Red Dead is mature enough to understand that tools carry moral weight from their purpose, not from purity alone. The bond between Hosea and Sadie could produce one especially good late scene. Sadie might accuse Hosea of thinking too much and moving too slowly. Hosea might answer that she thinks too little of how much she still wants to live. Sadie would hate that, because grief has made death feel almost negotiable to her. Hosea, who lived after Bessie when part of him did not want to, would recognize the danger. He would not tell her to stop being angry. He would tell her not to hand her life to the men who already took Jake. That is a line Sadie might actually hear. In the epilogue, that line would echo when Sadie becomes a bounty hunter. She is still violent, still restless, but she is alive on her own terms. Hosea's survival might not change her path dramatically, yet it could add one layer, a memory of someone who saw her death wish clearly and refused to romanticize it. Sadie does not need saving in a simple sense. She needs witnesses who can tell the difference between strength and self-destruction. Hosea could be one. The same kind of witnessing applies to Charles. Charles often carries moral weight quietly, acting where others talk. Hosea might privately tell Arthur that Charles is one of the few men among them who could live clean if the world would let him. Arthur would agree more than he says. This recognition matters because the gang often treats Charles's competence as useful without fully honoring its source. Charles is not merely skilled, he is principled. Hosea surviving would place more respect around that principle, making Charles less of a helper at the edge and more of a moral center in the escape effort. Hosea's view of Rain's Fall would be deeply respectful. He would see in Rain's Fall another older man trying to keep younger people from being fed into a war that pride and injustice have made almost inevitable. Their positions are not the same, and Hosea has no right to equate them, but he would feel the rhyme. Rain's Fall wants his son alive more than he wants symbolic victory. Hosea wants the gang's children and stragglers alive more than he wants Dutch's pride satisfied. Both men understand that survival can look like surrender to those addicted to glory. If Hosea and Rain's Fall ever spoke directly in this alternate version, the scene would be quiet and extraordinary. Two old men from very different worlds, both watching sons and followers pulled toward violence. Hosea would carry guilt as an outlaw whose gang has harmed many. Rain's Fall would carry the grief of a people under pressure Hosea can only partly understand. There would be no neat equality between their sufferings, but there could be recognition. Not comfort exactly, recognition. The knowledge that young blood is often spent by old failures. Such a scene would also shame Dutch without needing him present. Dutch likes to imagine himself as a champion of freedom, but around the Wapiti, he turns another people's struggle into cover for his own. Hosea speaking with Rain's Fall would reveal the humility Dutch lacks. Hosea does not need to make himself the hero of Rain's Fall's story. Dutch does. That difference exposes the moral rot of Dutch's late rebellion. He claims to fight power, but he cannot stop centering himself inside other people's pain. Arthur, witnessing that contrast, would move even more firmly away from Dutch. He respects Rain's Fall partly because Rain's Fall's grief does not perform itself for applause. Hosea, late in life, begins to resemble that kind of quiet more than Dutch's thunder. Arthur would see two older men who have lost too much and still prefer restraint over vanity. That sight would help him understand what a father figure can be when not addicted to being followed. This is one of the deepest changes Hosea's survival brings to Arthur's interior life. Arthur has always had two fathers in the gang: Dutch, the voice of belief, and Hosea, the voice of limits. When Hosea dies, Dutch's voice echoes louder, even as Arthur rejects it. When Hosea lives, Arthur does not have to define adulthood only against Dutch. He can define it partly through Hosea. A man can be guilty and still honest, tired and still useful, charming and still capable of humility, afraid and still brave enough to choose the smaller good. The alternate Arthur might therefore become less bitter in his final tenderness. Still angry, still sarcastic, still full of regret, but less alone with the idea that all fatherhood was manipulation. Hosea surviving lets Arthur keep one piece of the family without keeping the lie. That is emotionally enormous. Redemption is easier to walk toward when a person can carry one honest inheritance out of the wreckage. John would receive a similar inheritance, though he would resist it longer. Hosea has known John since he was a wild, difficult boy, saved from hanging by Dutch. He has seen John run from Abigail and Jack. He has seen him return, scarred and uncertain. Hosea would not flatter him as a natural family man. He would likely be blunt. Love is not a feeling you announce after nearly dying. It is a chore you repeat when the road gets boring. John needs that kind of advice because he often understands dramatic loyalty better than daily responsibility. Hosea might tell John that the ranch will be harder than robbing, and John would laugh because it sounds absurd. Hosea would not laugh. A robbery asks for nerve, planning, and luck over a short span. A home asks for humility every morning. John can ride into gunfire more easily than he can apologize to Abigail and mean it. Hosea knows this because he once tried domestic life with Bessie and lost it, and perhaps failed it in ways he never fully says. His advice to John would be weighted by regret, which makes it harder to ignore. Abigail would be the one who understands Hosea's advice fastest. She already knows home is work. She has been doing emotional labor inside the gang for years, trying to make John see what is directly in front of him. Hosea supporting her would not solve John's flaws, but it would change the room. Instead of Abigail sounding like the obstacle to adventure, she becomes the person the wisest surviving founder agrees with. That recognition would matter to her, even if she never says so softly. The alternate story also changes how we understand Dutch and Hosea's founding myth. Two young men trying to rob each other on the road to Chicago, laughing at the absurdity, becoming friends, building a gang. It is a charming origin, almost too charming, the kind of story Dutch would polish until it shines. Hosea surviving long enough to watch the ending would dull that shine. He might remember that the first moment of their friendship was mutual attempted theft. A joke, yes, but also a warning. Their whole brotherhood began with two men trying to take from each other and deciding to take from the world together instead. That memory could become painful for Hosea because the romance of the origin hides the seed of the downfall. They were clever, bold, and hungry. They mistook shared appetite for shared morality. For a while, they helped people and built bonds real enough to matter. But the old theft never fully left the foundation. Dutch kept taking belief. Hosea kept taking chances. The gang took money and called it freedom. Saint Denis becomes the place where the bill comes due for a story that began as a joke on a road. This does not mean Hosea would reduce his life with Dutch to fraud. That would be too simple and too cruel. He would remember nights when they fed people who had nothing. He would remember saving young Arthur, young John, Javier, Tilly, and others from worse fates. He would remember laughter, songs, scams that harmed only the greedy, and the intoxicating feeling that they had built a little republic outside the cruelty of the world. Some of that was real. The tragedy is that reality can become an excuse to ignore what follows it. Hosea's late honesty would be the ability to say both truths together. We loved each other, We harmed people. We saved some. We used others. Dutch was brilliant. Dutch became dangerous. Arthur was loyal. Arthur must leave. John was foolish. John deserves a chance. The gang was family. The gang must end. Red Dead lives in those paired truths. Hosea surviving would make them audible through a voice older than Arthur's and less corrupted than Dutch's. This is also why the what if should keep the pacing slow near the end. The thrill is not simply in altered mission outcomes, it is in watching a family system become more legible. Hosea's survival functions like a lamp brought into a room everyone has been arguing inside. The furniture was always there. The cracks were always there. The knife on the table was always there. The lamp does not remove danger. It makes denial harder. Denial is Dutch's last shelter. Denial that Blackwater was his fault. Denial that Saint Denis was a trap he should have sensed. Denial that Bronte humiliated him into recklessness. Denial that Lenny and Hosea were not sacrifices to destiny, but consequences of bad judgment and bad luck. Denial that Arthur's doubt is love trying to survive. Denial that Micah is a mirror held up to his worst self. Hosea, surviving, strips denial of some shadows. Dutch has to work harder to keep it. That harder work makes Dutch uglier sooner. This is not a failure of the what if, it is the point. Sometimes keeping a wise person alive does not save a proud person. It only reveals pride more clearly. If Dutch becomes defensive around Hosea, if he snaps at old advice, if he calls caution betrayal, the people around the campfire see something they might otherwise explain away. The mask slips in better light. Hosea would pay for that light. Dutch's anger would hurt him more than Arthur's suspicion ever could. Arthur expects harshness from Dutch late. Hosea remembers tenderness. When Dutch looks at him as if he is an obstacle, something old in Hosea would break. The bullet in Saint Denis damages his body. Dutch choosing Micah damages the memory of his life. Those are different wounds, and the second may be harder to bandage. Still, Hosea would keep working, because work is the only antidote to despair he trusts. Move Tilly. Warn Mary Beth. Watch Micah. Speak to Arthur. Help Abigail. Send word to Sadie. Ask Charles about the North Road. Tell Pearson to pack less than he wants. Tell Uncle to make himself useful, even if that means staying out of the way. These small acts become the rhythm of his last service. A dying dream creates many errands. Hosea's greatness is that he does not consider errands beneath him. There is a deep sadness in those errands, the kind that suits a slow telling. The end of an outlaw gang is more than gun smoke. It is folded blankets, hidden coins, whispered names, horses saddled quietly, a child told to stay close, an old woman deciding which keepsake to leave behind, a young woman pretending she is not afraid because fear might make goodbye harder. Hosea would see all of that. Dutch sees the banner. Hosea sees the packing. That is perhaps the cleanest summary of their difference. Dutch sees history. Hosea sees people. Dutch wants to be remembered. Hosea wants the living to get through the next road. Dutch speaks to the sky. Hosea checks whether there is enough food in the wagon. Neither quality alone explains the whole man, but late in the story the difference becomes everything. When the dream burns, the person checking the wagon is worth more than the person naming the fire destiny. The final train robbery would become the unavoidable crisis. Dutch and Micah would argue that they need one last score, money enough to disappear, proof that the gang can still beat the system. Hosea would hear the same lie he has heard too many times. One more score has become a prayer, with no God behind it. Arthur, by now diagnosed and weakening, would understand too. Money matters, yes. Money can help Abigail and Jack. Money can buy distance. But money gathered through Dutch's late plans has a way of turning into graves. Hosea might propose a different use of the final days. Recover what can be recovered from caches. Divide existing funds honestly. Sell horses quietly. Use old contacts. Send people in small groups. Do not gather everyone for a thunderclap robbery that announces the gang's location to the whole region. This is sensible, and that is why Dutch would reject it. Sensible plans do not feed his need to feel chosen. Dutch does not simply want escape. He wants escape that proves the world was wrong about him. Arthur would see that clearly with Hosea beside him. The sickness has already stripped away much of his patience for performance. When Dutch speaks of faith now, Arthur hears cost. When Micah speaks of strength, Arthur hears cowardice, looking for permission. Hosea does not need to tell Arthur what to think. He only needs to stand there, tired and wounded, embodying the old wisdom Dutch is refusing. Sometimes a person becomes an argument simply by surviving. Abigail's kidnapping by Milton would still be possible, perhaps even likely, because the Pinkertons are closing in and the camp is fractured. But the response would be different. Dutch refusing or hesitating to rescue her in the original story is one of the clearest signs that his family language has collapsed. With Hosea alive, that refusal would not pass through camp like confusion. It would ignite the split openly. Hosea would not let Dutch call abandoning Abigail strategic. He would name it for what it is. The rescue party might include Arthur, Sadie, and Hosea in some capacity, though Hosea's wound would limit him. He might not storm the building with a gun like younger men. He might plan the approach, secure the horses, misdirect a guard, or insist on going far enough to hear the truth himself. Milton's revelation that Micah has been informing after Guarma would land differently if Hosea is present or nearby. Arthur hearing it matters. Hosea hearing it would be devastating. The old conman would have his suspicion confirmed, and the confirmation would not bring satisfaction. It would bring the cold grief of being right too late. If Hosea returns to camp with Arthur and the truth about Micah, Dutch's final test becomes sharper. In the original story, Dutch can tell himself Arthur is sick, angry, disloyal, manipulated by John, or losing faith. If Hosea also accuses Micah, Dutch has to reject the judgment of his oldest friend. That is a different level of betrayal. It strips away Dutch's last respectable excuse. To choose Micah over Arthur is terrible. To choose Micah over Arthur and Hosea is spiritual suicide. The final camp confrontation would therefore become even more painful. Arthur, coughing and nearly spent, naming Micah as the rat. Hosea, pale but standing, confirming that the pattern fits, that the false information, the Pinkerton movements, and Milton's words all point to the same man. Susan Grimshaw turning her gun with old fury. Sadie, ready to kill Micah on the spot. John, arriving alive, proof that Dutch left him behind. Abigail and Jack's absence hanging over everything like a question the camp cannot answer. Dutch in the center, not as leader now, but as a man watching all his lies arrive at once. Micah would do what he always does. He would turn accusation into chaos. He would shout, laugh, insult, demand proof. Call Hosea old. Call Arthur dying. Call John ungrateful. Call Grimshaw a fool. Call Sadie mad. He would try to make the room too loud for truth. That is his real talent. Micah does not need people to believe him completely. He needs them uncertain long enough for violence to decide. But Hosea's presence would slow that tactic. Hosea knows that a liar's best friend is noise. He would bring the room back to one fact at a time. Would Dutch listen? That is the terrible center of the what if. A comforting version says, yes. Hosea speaks, Dutch breaks, Micah is exposed, the gang turns, and the old family saves itself at the last possible moment. But Red Dead Redemption 2 is not comforting, because Dutch's problem is not lack of information, it is need. He needs Micah's version of himself. He needs to believe that those who doubt him are betraying him. He needs the plan to remain sacred, because without the plan, he has to face the people he has killed for it. Hosea can make the truth unavoidable. He cannot make Dutch humble. So Dutch may hesitate. That hesitation would be enough to damn him. He might not fully defend Micah at first. He might ask for calm, for time, for everyone to lower their guns. But the very act of treating Micah's betrayal and Arthur's accusation as two equal sides would reveal the collapse. Hosea would see it. Arthur would see it. John would see it. Even Javier might see it and be wounded by what he sees. Dutch's failure would not be that he does not know whom to shoot. It would be that he cannot bring himself to choose the people who loved him over the man who feeds his pride. The Pinkerton attack would still break the standoff, because the outside world in Red Dead rarely waits for emotional truth to finish speaking. Gunfire crashes in. Men scatter. Horses scream. The camp that called itself family dissolves into smoke and mud. But this time, the lines are clearer. Hosea has named the rot. Arthur is not alone. John knows. Abigail knows. Sadie knows. Charles knows. Grimshaw, if Hosea's presence prevents Micah from shooting her in that first instant, may survive long enough to help the escape. The old camp discipline might live for one more useful hour. Arthur's final ride changes because of that. In the original story, he rides with the weight of almost total collapse, trying to get John out while Dutch and Micah's betrayal tears the last chords. In this version, Arthur still rides toward death, but not toward total isolation. Hosea has helped build exits. Abigail and Jack may already be farther away. Tilly and Mary Beth may be gone. Pearson may have money and a direction. Swanson may have left before the cave swallowed him. Arthur's last work becomes less frantic because some of it began earlier. That does not make Arthur's death less sad. It may make it sadder in a quieter way. He would know that Hosea survived Saint Denis only to watch the gang break anyway. He would know that love and wisdom were not enough to save Dutch from himself. But he would also know that Hosea's survival gave people chances. Arthur has always been a man who measures himself too harshly, but by the end he might see one clear thing. Saving the gang was impossible. Saving people was not. Hosea helped him learn the difference before the final morning. Would Hosea be with Arthur at the end? Perhaps not on the mountain. Not if the escape fractures as violently as it likely would. Arthur still might face Micah alone, or nearly alone, because Red Dead's final confrontations have a way of stripping a man down to his truest choice. But Hosea's presence would be felt in Arthur's decision. Help John. Do not go back for the money unless the soul has already been lost. Spend the last strength on a living family. Let Dutch's dream die if dying is the only honest thing it can do. Hosea may not stand on the ridge, but his lesson would. Micah and Arthur's final fight would carry an added layer. Micah would be fighting the dying enforcer who exposed him and the entire old moral order of the gang. Arthur's loyalty turned truthful, Hosea's suspicion confirmed, Grimshaw's discipline, Sadie's fury, Charles's decency, Abigail's demand for family over fantasy. Micah hates those things because they reveal him as small. He thrives where people are afraid, greedy, or vain. He withers under quiet moral clarity. Arthur's body may fail, but the clarity would not. Dutch arriving at that final fight would be even more haunted. In the original story, Arthur's words reach him too late to save Arthur, but perhaps not too late to crack the spell. In this version, Dutch would carry Hosea's words too. He would have rejected his son and his brother, the dying man's accusation, and the oldest friend's warning. When Arthur tells him, in whatever words this version allows, that Micah is the rat and Dutch has let him destroy them, Dutch would hear Hosea behind it. That echo might be unbearable. Dutch might still walk away. That is the awful truth of him. He often chooses absence when presence would require humility. He walks away from Arthur. He later walks away from Micah's body. He walks away from John after Mount Hagen. Dutch's final talent is leaving the room before anyone can make him stay and explain himself. Hosea surviving would not necessarily change that. It would make the walking away heavier, because he would be leaving more truth behind. After Arthur's death, Hosea's role becomes almost ghost-like even while alive. The gang is gone. The dream is gone. Dutch is somewhere in the wilderness with the ruins of his ego. Micah is alive for the moment, building his own ugly camp out of greed and leftovers. John, Abigail, and Jack are trying to stay ahead of the law. Sadie is turning grief into bounty work. Charles is helping where he can, then moving toward his own path. Hosea, old and wounded, becomes a keeper of exits and letters, a man making sure the people who can live do not wander back into the fire. He would not join John at Pronghorn Ranch openly. Too dangerous, too recognizable, too much past. But he might pass through under another name, older, thinner, with a beard changed or a hat pulled low. Jack might remember him as a kindly old man who smelled faintly of tobacco and medicine and looked at John with both love and warning. Abigail would understand before John does that Hosea's presence is not a reunion, it is a reminder. The past is not dead just because it has learned to knock softly. The 1907 epilogue becomes one of the most interesting parts of the What If. In the original story, John, Sadie, and Charles go after Micah, Dutch appears, Micah dies, and Ross later follows the trail toward Beecher's hope. If Hosea is alive, he would beg John not to go, not with weakness, but with the authority of a man who has seen revenge open too many doors. He would say Arthur did not give John a chance, so John could spend it chasing a rat into the mountains. He would say Abigail is right to fear the old life. He would say Micah deserves death, but Jack deserves a father more. John might still go. That is one of the saddest and most honest answers. Hosea can change much, but he cannot change the part of John that needs to settle accounts with the past before he can believe in the future. Sadie would still want Micah, because Micah's survival is an insult to everyone buried behind them. Charles might understand Hosea's warning and still ride, because he will not let John and Sadie go alone. Hosea would watch them leave and know the shape of the mistake, because he has watched versions of it for 40 years. If Hosea follows them, he likely does not climb the mountain with a gun. That would turn him into a figure the story does not need. His role is not to become young again. His role is to make the cost visible. Maybe he waits below. Maybe he sends one final warning. Maybe he arrives after the shooting, seeing Micah dead, Dutch gone, and John holding money that feels both useful and cursed. Hosea would understand immediately what history later proves. The money solves a debt and creates a trail. Dutch seeing Hosea on Mount Hagen, if it happens, would be devastating. Imagine Dutch, after shooting Micah, turning to John, Sadie, and the old friend he betrayed by choosing Micah in the first place. There would be no speech large enough for that moment. Dutch might try one. He might say Hosea looks well, or that it was all a mess, or that Micah fooled everyone, or that Arthur was a good man. Hosea would not need to answer much. A look from him would be worse than a bullet. Dutch has always survived by narrating himself. Hosea's silence would refuse the narration. This version of Mount Hagen would not end with Hosea killing Dutch. That would be too clean and not true to the old bond. Hosea loved Dutch, and love sometimes makes the hand slower even when judgment is clear. He might let Dutch walk because killing him would not restore anyone, and because Dutch's worst punishment is continuing to be Dutch, with no one left to believe the performance. Or perhaps Hosea is simply too tired. Not every moral decision arrives in thunder. Sometimes an old man lets another old man disappear because all the words have been spent. The money would still tempt John because money is not evil by itself. Money buys Beecher's hope. Money pays debts. Money lets Abigail and Jack sleep under a roof. Hosea would know that. He has stolen enough to understand the practical mercy of cash. But he would also know that money taken from Micah's mountain is soaked in attention. It has a history. It brings eyes. John using it does not make him wicked, it makes him visible. Red Dead's tragedy is often that survival and danger come wrapped in the same bundle. If Hosea lives beyond 1907, he might become a hidden footnote in John's life, a man Abigail writes to once or twice, a name Jack half remembers, a shadow who sends a little money and refuses to say where he is. He would not move into Beecher's Hope because the ranch needs a future, not an old outlaw sitting on the porch like a warning sign. Hosea's love would express itself through distance. That is a sad kind of love, but Red Dead is full of it. Sometimes the kindest thing a dangerous person can do is stay away from the people he wants to protect. Would Ross still find John? Almost certainly. Hosea surviving cannot erase the machinery of the first Red Dead Redemption. Ross has government power, patience, files, bodies, rumors, bank loans, property documents, and the long memory of the law. The age of outlaws is ending. Because institutions do not need to be brilliant every day. They need to keep files. Hosea can help John avoid some mistakes, but he cannot make John invisible forever once John tries to build a visible home under his own name. That is why the what if should not pretend Hosea can defeat history. Hosea's gift is human-scale salvation. He can save a person, delay a disaster, expose a lie, move a family, soften a death, and make a choice clearer. He cannot stop federal power, capitalism, industrial expansion, Dutch's ego, Micah's treachery, Arthur's tuberculosis, or John's tragic inability to leave revenge alone. The century is larger than him, but being smaller than history does not make him meaningless. Red Dead Redemption 2 is built around that truth. The emotional victory of Hosea surviving Saint Denis is that Arthur would not spend his final days quite so alone. That matters more than any tactical change. Arthur's late-game loneliness is one of the story's deepest aches. He sees Dutch clearly, but being right isolates him. He becomes the man carrying truth through a camp that no longer wants truth. With Hosea alive, Arthur has someone who remembers the old Dutch, sees the new Dutch, and understands why the difference is killing him. That companionship would not cure Arthur. It would let him die less gaslit by the family he served. Hosea and Arthur's last real conversation might be the heart of the whole alternate story. Not a grand scene, maybe just a night near the edge of camp, with the trees moving and the lantern turned low. Arthur coughing into a cloth, Hosea pretending not to look until Arthur stops pretending not to be dying. Hosea might admit that he should have left years ago. Arthur might say they all should have. Hosea might say that regret is only useful if it points the living somewhere better. Arthur might laugh softly, because Hosea can still turn sorrow into instruction. Arthur might ask whether Dutch was always like this. Hosea would take time before answering. The honest answer is not simple. Dutch was always vain, always theatrical, always hungry for belief. But he was also generous, brave, and capable of making lost people feel less lost. The seeds were there, but seeds are not the whole tree. Time, pressure, blood, failure, Micah, and Dutch's own choices grew them into something poisonous. Hosea would not absolve Dutch by saying he changed completely, and he would not flatten him by saying he was always empty. He would offer Arthur the harder truth. People can become worse by protecting the lies they love most. That truth would help Arthur forgive himself in a specific way. Arthur's guilt is about the people he has hurt and the years he spent believing. If Dutch was always a fraud, then Arthur feels like a fool. If Dutch was once partly genuine, then Arthur's loyalty was not meaningless, only outlived. Hosea could give him that distinction. You were not stupid for loving what was real. You would be wrong to keep serving what is gone. That may be the most valuable thing Hosea could tell him. The last phase of the story would therefore feel less like a rescue of the gang, and more like the rescue of meaning from the gang's ruins. Arthur's redemption becomes more deliberate. Hosea's survival gives him language for it. John and Abigail's escape becomes a planned inheritance rather than a desperate improvisation. Sadie's rage is directed toward protection as much as revenge. Charles finds allies who share his concern for the Wapiti, instead of watching Dutch exploit them unchecked. Tilly, Mary Beth, Pearson and Swanson leave with less of the feeling that they are abandoning family and more of the truth that family should not demand their deaths. Dutch becomes more clearly responsible because Hosea is alive to remove the excuse of grief. In the original story, Hosea's death helps explain Dutch's unraveling, though it does not excuse it. In this version, Dutch cannot say the old voice is gone, the old voice is present. Dutch simply refuses it. That makes his fall less chaotic and more damning. He is not a man abandoned by wisdom. He is a man walking away from wisdom because flattery feels better. Micah becomes more desperate because the room is less favorable to him. He can still win many moments. He can still lie, kill, inform, and survive longer than he deserves. But he cannot so easily rewrite the emotional reality of the camp. Hosea knows what he is. Arthur knows. Sadie knows. Charles knows. Grimshaw likely knows. Abigail knows enough not to trust him near anyone she loves. Micah's victory, if it happens, becomes uglier because it happens under brighter light. He does not corrupt a blind family. He helps destroy a family that has begun to see and still cannot fully stop him. That may be the most painful version of tragedy, not ignorance, but insufficient power. The people who see the truth do not always win in time. Hosea can expose the shape of the disaster. Arthur can choose rightly at the end. Sadie can fight. Charles can protect. Abigail can run. John can try. But the damage already done by years of loyalty, crime, and denial is enormous. A falling building does not stand again because someone finally names the crack in the wall. Naming it may only help people find the door. And in this what if, finding the door is Hosea's greatest achievement. Not saving Dutch, not preserving the Van der Linde gang, not restoring some golden age that likely never existed as purely as anyone remembers. Hosea's achievement would be helping more people leave before the collapse becomes total. That is quieter than revenge and less glamorous than a successful robbery. It is also better. By the end, Hosea surviving Saint Denis changes the moral temperature of the story more than the historical outcome. Arthur still dies because his sickness is already written in his body. The gang still ends because its contradictions are too deep. Dutch still falls because pride has become his shelter. Micah still poisons because that is what Micah does. John may still walk toward the future that will one day destroy him, but the road between Saint Denis and the end is less lonely, less confused, and less completely surrendered to Dutch's noise. The city of Saint Denis would remain the place where everything breaks, but not the place where Hosea disappears. Instead, it becomes the place where Hosea is forced to stop being Dutch's balance and start being Dutch's witness. That is a different role. A balance can steady a man. A witness can only tell the truth about why he fell. Hosea would spend his surviving days learning that difference, and Arthur would learn it beside him. There is something beautifully cruel in that. Hosea survives, and because he survives, he has to watch more. He has to watch Dutch choose Micah. He has to watch Arthur die. He has to watch John nearly repeat old mistakes. He has to watch the age end in ledgers, railroads, bank loans, lawmen, and graves. Survival is not a gift without cost. Sometimes surviving means being appointed keeper of grief. But Hosea was always a keeper of grief. Bessie dies before the game begins, and part of Hosea never fully returns from that loss. He knows what it is to drift back into outlaw life, because ordinary life became too empty. That history is why he understands John and Abigail's chants better than Dutch does. Hosea has tried domestic peace and lost it. He knows its value because he knows its absence. Dutch treats peace like a destination after glory. Hosea knows peace is fragile, ordinary, and worth more than glory. That is why he would look at Beecher's hope, if he ever saw it, with a sadness deeper than nostalgia. A house being built by John, Uncle, and Charles would not look like much compared with Dutch's speeches. But Hosea would understand that boards, nails, debts, fences, and morning chores are the very things the gang never learned to respect. The old life made domestic work seem small. The whole story proves it was never small. A home is harder to build than a robbery, and easier to lose. If Jack remembers Hosea at all, that memory might become one of the gentlest changes. In the original timeline, Jack inherits stories of people already dead or gone. In this version, he may have one living memory of an old man from the gang who did not ask him to worship the outlaw life. Hosea might give him a book, a coin trick, a little joke, a warning disguised as a story. Jack would not understand all of it then. Later, when he becomes old enough to read The Shape of His Family, he might remember that not every outlaw wanted the boy to become one. That small memory matters because Red Dead Redemption is, in the end, about inheritance. What do violent people leave their children? Names, enemies, money, land, guilt, skills, stories, and danger. Hosea surviving gives the inheritance one more thread of caution. Jack still inherits tragedy, but perhaps he also inherits a clearer warning. Charm can rot, loyalty can trap, and the smartest man in the room is sometimes the one quietly arranging for the children to leave it. The final image of Hosea's alternate life should not be a shootout. It should be a letter, old handwriting, a little shaky, sent from no return address, telling John to stay with Abigail, to teach the boy something other than guns, to keep away from men who speak too beautifully about necessary violence. Maybe John reads it and listens for a while. Maybe not long enough. Maybe Abigail keeps it after everything. Maybe Jack finds it years later and hears in the old paper one more voice from the vanished family telling him that survival is not the same as freedom unless a person learns what to stop carrying. So what if Hosea survived Saint Denis? The gang would still die, but it would die with more truth spoken over it. Dutch would still fall, but he would fall after rejecting the one man who remembered him best. Micah would still poison, but the poison would be named earlier. Arthur would still face the morning, but with less loneliness behind his eyes. John would still struggle toward a home, but with one more warning folded in his pocket. Abigail, Jack, Tilly, Mary Beth, Pearson, Swanson, and perhaps even Grimshaw would have better chances to leave before the last fire. The world would not become kind. It would become slightly less wasteful with the people who still had time. And maybe that is enough for a Red Dead what if. Not a miracle. Not a clean rescue. Not Dutch redeemed by friendship at the last second, or Micah exposed before damage can touch anyone. Just an old con man surviving one bullet long enough to show the family where the exits are. A man who once helped build the dream, staying alive long enough to admit the dream has become dangerous. Hosea Matthews would not save the Linde gang. He would save the truth from dying with him on a Saint Denis street. And as the night settles over that alternate road, Saint Denis grows quiet again in memory. The bank doors close. The gas lamps tremble in the wet air. Somewhere, far from the city, Arthur coughs beside a low fire. John holds his son a little closer. Dutch rides away from the last honest mirror he had. And Hosea sits with a blanket around his shoulders, old eyes open, listening to the century arrive. He has survived, but he has not won. He has only done what wisdom can do when the world is already moving too fast. He has pointed toward the door, spoken softly, and hoped the living would have the courage to walk through it.